Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
It was another dramatic year for world Jewry in 2016. A wave of Palestinian terror that began in September of 2015 continued into 2016, as more than 40 Israelis were murdered and more than 600 Israelis were wounded in lone wolf attacks of stabbings, shootings, and those caused by cars, trucks, and tractors. And in 2016, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process remained dormant. In May, Prime Minister Netanyahu shook up his coalition government by making new accommodations to the Israeli right, causing Israel's Minister of Defense, Bogi Ya'alon, himself a member of the right, to resign. And in this political climate in Israel, tensions grew throughout 2016 over Jewish pluralism in Israel, as an Israeli Supreme Court ruled in July that conversions performed by Orthodox rabbis in America would not be recognized in Israel, including conversions performed by Rabbi Haskell Lookstein, a prominent modern Orthodox rabbi who converted Donald Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump. And a month later, in August of 2016, an Israeli cabinet decision that had been made in January approving Natan Sharansky's compromise plan to establish a third egalitarian section at the Western Wall collapsed when it fell prey to renewed opposition by the ultra-Orthodox religious establishment in Israel. On a positive note, in July of 2016, Israel and Turkey agreed to normalize diplomatic relations, ending a 6-year rift after Israel agreed to pay $20 million to the families of those who died on the Mavi Marmara in 2010, when Israeli commandos boarded the ship that was part of a flotilla bent on running the Israeli blockade of Gaza. In October of 2016, within the United Nations, UNESCO voted to rename Jewish historical sites in Israel with Muslim names, including the Western Wall and the Temple Mount, as well as the Cave of Machpelah in the West Bank city of Hebron. Also at the UN in 2016, efforts grew in support of a Security Council resolution that would unilaterally create a Palestinian state on the West Bank, with some left-wing Jewish groups lobbying the Obama administration to refrain from exercising a veto. In Europe, 2016 saw a continued exodus of Jews making Aliyah, as extremist Muslim anti-Semitism made life for the Jews of France and other countries of Western Europe more and more untenable. While in the United States, the BDS movement that seeks to delegitimize the State of Israel through boycotts, divestment, and sanctions was seen as a greater threat in the halls of academia and on college campuses. And the Anti-Defamation League found itself in the center of a firestorm, as its new national director, Jonathan Greenblatt, was criticized for changing the focus of the ADL, less on fighting anti-Semitism and more on left-wing agendas, after Greenblatt took public stands supporting J Street, Black Lives Matter, and Congressman Keith Ellison, a potential pick to head the new Democratic National Committee. And of course, like every other group in America, the Jewish community was preoccupied with the presidential election and the surprise victory of Donald Trump, which has exacerbated divisiveness within the Jewish community, typified by the public position taken by Rabbi Rick Jacobs, president of the Union for Reform Judaism, against the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations for the conference's co-sponsoring a Hanukkah party with Azerbaijan at the new Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C., and a widening divide within the Jewish community over Donald Trump's nominating right-leaning David Friedman as the next U.S. ambassador to Israel. And to be sure, there was a special sadness shared throughout the Jewish world in 2016 as we lost two giants of modern Jewish life, the last of the founding fathers' generation of the State of Israel, Shimon Peres, and the man who became the moral conscience of America, if not the world, the man who taught a generation born after World War II the meaning and significance of the Shoah, Elie Wiesel. These are just some of what made the Jewish year of 2016 momentous, and a year that will impact the Jewish future for years and years to come. I'm Mark Golub. Welcome to our traditional year-end L'chaim Roundtable, where this year we take a look back at the calendar year 2016 and the events and people which had a special impact on the Jewish community and which are likely to have ongoing influence on Jewish life in the future. And as always, I am joined by four individuals whom I hope you've come to know well on JBS. They're all intimately involved with events in the Jewish world, and they bring wonderful insight and perspective to the issues challenging Jewish life today, and they are all fan favorites. Let me introduce them once again to you. Stephen Bayme is the director of the Contemporary Life Department of the American Jewish Committee and the AJC's Koppelman Institute on American Jewish-Israeli Relations. Rabbi Eric Yoffie is President Emeritus of the Union for Reform Judaism and a columnist for Haaretz and a frequent guest speaker and scholar in residence in communities across America. Betty Ehrenberg is the Executive Director of the World Jewish Congress of North America. And Thane Rosenbaum is a Distinguished Fellow at NYU Law School, is also Director of the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society, and is an award-winning essayist and best-selling author whose most recent novel is entitled How Sweet It Is, a novel about Jewish life in 1972 Miami. And it is so wonderful that all of you make the trip out to Fort Lee and sit with me again for a look back at 2016. Thank you all very, very much. I asked you all to give thought from your own perspective. What was the single most striking, important, momentous event of 2016? I just want to hear what each of you feel is the event of 2016 from the Jewish perspective. For you, it is?
Presidential election.
Interesting. For you?
Presidential election.
For you?
The loss of Elie Wiesel.
And for you?
Presidential election.
How interesting. Okay. I discussed this before we met, and I was really anxious to hear how many of you would say, of all that happened in 2016, the most important Jewish event that impacts the Jewish world is the presidential election. You began there. Why?
I think American Jewry as a whole was surprised by it, as was so many others, that we were confronted with an administration that in many ways is unpredictable. We don't have much of a handle of where its policies are going. We need to build our ties to it in much stronger ways. So it's almost like it's a new ball game. In almost every other previous presidential election, I could have predicted where the course of events would lie and what the implications would be for the Jewish community. In this case, we're talking about a very surprising event that all the commentators got wrong, all the talking heads, the chatterboxes all missed the cues. And now we're looking at what are the implications. And in that respect, it seemed to me it's potentially, perhaps it's not a game changer at all. There's just continuity with previous American policy. Or, and I think certainly the signals are heading this direction, we're looking at some very significant changes, many of which may be satisfactory to some Jews, many of which may be very unsatisfactory.
Very interesting. I understand why the election was, so dramatic and overshadowed so much. To say that it was the most important Jewish event, I find that interesting. Okay, why?
It was a tremendous surprise, in a sense maybe the most dramatic political surprise in a half a century or perhaps more. But it not only surprised us, but I think it substantially changes the politics of America and the politics of international relations and everybody on the international scene.
Including Israel.
Including Israel. In particular, Israel is absolutely impacted, I imagine, in a dramatic way. It is interesting that in the course of this campaign, as prior to the election and after the election, the amount of time we spent discussing anti-Semitism. That's why you shouldn't be surprised for me to say that. I've said before, I wrote an article in 2014 saying anti-Semitism is a problem around the world. It's not a problem for American Jews. But all segments of the American Jewish community were engaged in a rather contentious debate about, were we seeing a new anti-Semitism? How much impact would it have? How did the Trump campaign contribute or not contribute to that? That in and of itself tells us that something very, very important is going on. And then secondly, I would simply say international relations, I think as we have understood it, are changing, have changed already.
How?
Israel depends on certain fundamentals. It depends on American leadership in the world. It depends on America as sort of the senior partner and the senior force in the Middle East. It depends on a network of alliances among democratic countries in particular, and among other countries who can be pushed in a democratic direction. All of those things at this moment are in question. And for example, what will the role of the Russians be in the Middle East? A dramatic, important, significant question to which we do not yet have an answer, and one that will be of tremendous importance to Israel. All these issues have been raised. Now, some people, of course, assume that Israel will simply benefit from this new administration in a whole variety of ways. The answer is it might. We'll see. I have a darker view, and I have broader concerns. I think a geopolitical overview of current realities causes concern for the American people as a whole, but in particular for those of us who are lovers and supporters of Israel.
Okay. Thane, as you listen to Eric, what thoughts go through your mind, and why do you also say the presidential election is the most important Jewish event of 2016?
Well, I see it slightly differently. I look at the election and think about the way in which Jewish identity itself was insinuated into the discussion. No one's discussed yet that there was a Jewish candidate, Bernie Sanders, who was running for president and had received a large number of progressive votes, even among Jews. And he was openly critical of Israel as a Jewish candidate. We've never seen anything like this before, right? In fact, part of his popularity, sort of the sense of, look, I'm a Jew from Brooklyn, look how morally superior I am to all of you. I'm really critical of Israel, and I think the amount of Palestinian casualties is untenable, right? And this was his position. He continued to reiterate it during the debate, and I don't think we all spoke about it enough, how astonishing that was.
And chose to do it in New York City.
And to do it in New York City. It's sort of in your face. Let me tell you what I think. Donald Trump's daughter was an Orthodox Jew, and it was repeated everywhere. This was something that became part of the national discussion, that he had a Jewish grandchild, and that the son-in-law, the Jewish son-in-law, was, the new Mordechai of the Purim series story.
The modern Purim story.
The modern part, the ultimate court Jew, right? I mean, he makes Henry Kissinger look like a amateur. By the way, this is a court Jew who actually was probably wealthier than the king. So there were so many interesting things about him as well. And I think what Eric is saying is also something that I spoke about once on this program, about the revival of a kind of creepy, old-school anti-Semitism that lingered throughout the campaign and was very much connected to Donald Trump. And yet, at the same time, you had, and I'm not sure how profound we're going to experience this sort of change in the Jewish demographic sensibility about Democrats versus Republicans. I mean, I don't know what the numbers are, and Steve follows this much more than I do, but I suspect that Donald Trump received far more Jewish votes than anyone expected.
Actually,
No, that's
Pew
not
shows
true.
71% of the American Jewish community
And so
voted
that's
for Clinton.
Exactly,
71%.
And how many
Which
voted
is
for?
consistent with what's always been
Yes.
happening.
What's interesting is it wasn't higher,
Yeah.
but it wasn't lower.
But it seems, I think we've talked about this here. I admit, you and I both, I received, I wouldn't call it hate mail, but from being on this show, I once said here after the election, I said, well, the amount of anti-Semitism that we saw was disturbing.
The hate mail I got was from Jews.
Yes,
Well,
yes.
that's not anti-Semitism.
No. What I'm saying is I received the same hate mail that you did about the fact that I was even suggesting that this
Yes,
had
by the way,
anything to do with Donald
I
Trump.
got hate mail from left and right. No matter what I said, the other side thought
Yeah.
I was supporting the other candidate.
I would say I have not seen in my lifetime a Republican candidate, even if the number was only 29% of the vote, that felt as passionately about their Republican candidate than they did about Trump.
I remember they were very passionate about Ronald Reagan as well.
Really?
Yeah, Jews for Reagan, big. But I don't understand, and I don't know if this is what you meant also, Eric. I don't understand what you mean by saying there was anti-Semitism in the Trump campaign.
Not in the campaign, but it seemed to be attracting
What
a kind of.
what are you- what
It's
are
so
you
funny.
referring-
We've done this now
Yes,
several
I don't-
times on this show, and this
I
is the
don't
one
see
thing
it.
you and I always argue about. We
Right.
never argue about anything else. It's this.
Well, where do you see it?
Well, first of all, as you know, the Twitter war that was very prevalent about anybody who had anything negative to say about Donald Trump was hammered. We saw Jewish journalists receiving photographs of themselves in concentration camp uniforms, saying, "You would make a great-looking lampshade." We saw a kind of normalizing of old.
Where did you see it, by the way?
We saw a lot of it online. And you saw a lot of it.
Did you see it personally?
Oh, absolutely. And on YouTube, you saw a lot of what was being said at Trump rallies. People forget about how oftentimes a piece of the rally would break off and someone was being screamed at about being a Jew. And this happened repeatedly throughout the
But I
campaign.
don't think that's anything different than what we've been seeing on social media for a long time now. Social media allows people to say really awful, horrible things that they wouldn't have said normally or ordinarily. They can hide behind whatever hashtag or name or whatever it is, and that did not surprise me. So I think that I really feel that what we've been seeing is a kind of anti-Semitism that's always been under the surface and that every so often just percolates to the top. We forgot for a long time about the John Birches. We forgot a long time about the Lyndon LaRouches. None of this seems strange to me or new to me. It seems that because of the way that the rhetoric was in this campaign and the social media, which I really felt was the key factor in allowing this kind of rhetoric, it's all come again to the
But Mark,
surface.
you
but it's
don't
not
see it
new.
at all, though.
No, I don't see it in either.
I think it's
new.
important to point this out. You
I
don't see this as a concern
no,
at all.
I do not believe there was any significant anti-Semitism involved, and I think that there are people who are willing to ascribe things to Donald Trump, even if they represent a minuscule fraction of those who support him, and at the same time will not do the same with Hillary Clinton. And I'm not choosing Trump over Clinton. I'm only arguing one thing, and I've argued this from day one. We should be fair, and we should hold both sides to the exact same standard. It isn't done. And I know it became fashionable to say all kinds of criticisms of Donald Trump that had to do with character, not policy. There is so much legitimate that one could be against either candidate, legitimate, that I was always infuriated.
But the
Mark,
progressive...
I expect just what was different in this election compared to others. We had the Birchers before, but the lid on within the context of a presidential election, the taboo on not expressing anti-Semitism, that taboo was broken.
Where was it expressed?
Well,
Steve?
say it didn't come necessarily from inside the campaign,
But-
the fact that it was done out around the campaign during the course of the election, as bad as the Birchers were, During 1964, it's not as if they started expressing anti-Semitism. In that sense, I think we have to, I'm not paranoid about this, but in terms of seeing this election from any kind of comparative historical perspective, since 1945, since the end of World War II, the constant nature of political discourse in this country has been less anti-Semitism rather than more. Jews at times frequently detect more. I think that's what you're criticizing. But if you're looking at this particular election, what surprised me is that given the internet, the taboo on expressing anti-Jewish caricatures, anti-Jewish sentiments, that taboo seems to have been lifted. I think it would be silly to ignore it.
I'm hearing from Thane, from Steve, I think from Eric, that there was a meaningful uptick of anti-Semitism, which I now hear is on the web. Did you experience that?
I did not find an uptick in anti-Semitism in general. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm saying that we have been seeing this uptick in anti-Semitism in the past few years on campus. We didn't see it in the political arena as much because we didn't have an election campaign going on.
But Steve is saying to you it was worse in this campaign. Did you experience
which
it as
I
worse?
find as a result of...
But did you experience it or see it or talk to people who said to you that experienced anti-Semitism?
On the social media alone.
And what
people's
did you
comments.
What did you see?
You saw nasty comments. You saw people willing to call Jews kikes and say worse things.
Who did this because of Donald Trump?
No, who did this because they... who did this because of the general rhetoric about Mexicans and...
That's his point. His point is that Donald Trump created a climate in which anti-Semitism could be more visibly articulated. Is he right in your position, in your view?
I'm trying to say that it's a larger thing. That once a candidate says, we don't want Muslims or we don't want Mexicans, then you can say we don't like Jews. And then the gates are opened and the floodgates are opened and everything is let loose. That's what I'm trying to say.
By the way, did Donald Trump ever say he didn't want Mexicans?
I think he was I think that was the first group that he maligned.
The issue about the judge
that's not what, by the way, that's not what he said.
But the issue about the judge and the wall, in different ways, they both express this sense of we don't want them around.
He
By the
began
way-
his
by the way,
campaign with a rather specific statement in which he referred to Mexicans in general as rapists, and then there was a caveat, well, maybe we have some good people there as well. He used derogatory terminology that if it had been used toward Jews, we would have been outraged.
By the way, I'm going to read it. Here's what he said. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. The Mexican government is forcing the most unwanted people into the United States. He never said all Mexicans. He then made a point of making a distinction between the illegal immigrants and legal immigrants. He talked about a wall with a big, beautiful door. And I don't understand why, when we discuss Trump, and this is not in support of Trump, I'm upset with the way in which only a piece of what he said is talked about. And yes, by the way, the statistics that come out of the federal government are astounding. They're very frightening in terms of the extent to which there is crime in the illegal immigrant population. That's just a reality. All he was saying was, and he did tap into people's fear. I don't believe, by the way, he generated fear. I think people were afraid. People are afraid. And it was the way in which the media then discussed this and repeated it without any of the subtlety.
But his responsibility in it was the tone that he used. If you use a certain kind of a tone and you give a kind of you give an impression that you're trying to
Was he anti-immigrant?
paint a group with a broad brush.
He didn't do that. And that's
Marcus,
that's in the eye of the beholder.
It is in the eye
of the
I want to
beholder.
suggest
I think
it's
it's
an
in the tone.
extraordinarily generous interpretation.
It's in the eye of the beholder.
that you have given.
No, the problem
Go
was,
back and watch the video
Oh,
if you've forgotten it.
I did. Oh,
I believe that most of the American people who saw that video got a vibration that's strongly suggested prejudice and bigotry.
but when you said most, did you say most?
Yes.
Okay. How did he win?
Well, that's a whole different question. But anti-Semitism, I don't want to pass without making a reference to Steve Bannon. And I'm fascinated that nobody has mentioned him because it consumed the press coverage. You know, for so long, there were literally hundreds of articles about Steve Bannon. Now,
Steve Bannon anti-Semitic?
is he personally anti-Semitic? No. Is he a facilitator of anti-Semitism? Did he provide a platform for prejudice and bigotry in this country? And the answer is yes.
Is that? Do you agree?
Look, I've never gone on Breitbart News.
Is that your
so-
view?
I'll say what I've said before. Donald Trump and Steve Bannon, who was clearly credited with framing his message, attracted a nativistic, xenophobic, and in some instances mildly anti-Semitic clientele. And whether it was Donald Trump's intention to do that, I don't think Donald Trump is an anti-Semite, but he also was loath, and I think the right word is loath, to denounce David Duke when everyone would have said, look, I know he is, and that's not what I want. That's not who I'm about, and that's not. And I think Donald Trump is the kind of narcissist who says, if you like me, I'm not going to turn you off. You know, everyone, you know, the press hates me. I can see what he was thinking. The press hates me. The intellectuals hate me. I'm not turning these people off. They're showing up to my rallies. They're with me. And in the meantime, I'm going to ride with them. And I'm not prepared to reject them. But this was the point that I think Steve made. In what other political campaign would not have the leader of one of the parties not immediately denounced the neo-Nazi KKK group? Right? I mean, you say, of course. Here he says, I don't know who he is. I don't know. I've never met the man.
Absolutely right.
Clearly shifting away from denouncing anything.
It took him a long time.
And I think it was because of what I was saying that, and I think it's a little what Eric is saying is that it's, yes, I don't think any of us are saying that Donald Trump was anti-Semitic, or even for that matter, Steve Bannon. But they saw a segment of the American population that had felt excluded and felt angry and were tired of a progressive agenda and didn't care about LGBT rights or bathrooms for that matter, and really certainly were resented the Black Lives Matter movement and felt that Wall Street bankers who had paid themselves with bonuses that came out of stimulus money, on and on, right? The crew that was part of the 99% or Occupy Wall Street, the same crew that we saw sort of immediately gravitating on the right, who felt that they were not participating not just in American democracy, but in American riches. Donald Trump knew that community. He knew them better than any of us. That's why everyone else misjudged that. And I think that community he held together, and part of the tissue, the connective tissue that held them together was hatred.
Okay. Do you agree that Steve Bannon, who was chosen to be Trump's chief strategist, facilitates anti-Semitism?
I don't know, as Steve said, it's not a policy-making position that he's been appointed
Doesn't matter.
to.
Eric's point is he chooses people around him who facilitate anti-Semitism. And there's nobody I should be able to ask who better than you, is that
Thank
true?
you so
Is that
much.
true? Here's the problem I have. I'm not saying who I voted for, not only because I think it's inappropriate for me to do that. I obviously, and the audience does know this, I come out of a long liberal tradition. I'm like every other New York American Jewish kid whose parents were passionately in the Democratic camp, and there's no social position that I would take that is not seen as progressive and on a liberal side. At the same time, I don't want my people to be guilty of hypocrisy or painting with a brush that reflects a media story and not the truth. And I've been trying just to ask, what's the truth here? What's your evidence? Last time we were together, we spoke about the Jewish star, the star that was in an ad. I don't believe anybody thinks it was, he meant it, anybody meant it as Jewish.
Or the Yellen and the Soros.
And when he asked people to raise his hand and promised to vote for him, all of a sudden it was described as a Nazi salute. That was just, it was, in my mind, it was outrageous that Jews would do something like that. And my problem here is, Donald Trump won the election. I didn't see it coming. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody saw it coming.
He didn't
But
see
then,
it coming.
I don't know that. But I'm shocked by who won it for him. Who won the election for Donald Trump?
Unemployed people in the Middle West.
No, I'll tell you who won. People who voted twice for Barack Obama. These aren't deplorable people. These aren't racists.
I'm not saying
These aren't xenophobes. By the way, he wins Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania because people who voted for Obama twice vote for Trump. How do you explain that?
No,
In other words, the problem here is, I don't think we should come on right now and say that an evil force, a dark force, somehow took hold of America and put Donald Trump in the White
You're
House.
not saying
Mark,
anything
nobody
about
is
Hillary
saying
Clinton
that.
being a weak candidate.
Yes, by the way, I believe almost.
By the way,
I believe if
that's a big
almost
factor in
any other
this.
Democrat would have beaten Trump. But I'm only saying it's interesting to me that Trump doesn't win unless people who voted for Obama twice
But so what?
vote for him.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of double standard, in other words, to the extent that we see prejudice and bigotry, and we see anti-Semitism, we oppose it.
Absolutely.
We speak against it.
Absolutely.
I'm not suggesting that's the reason that Trump won. I think we can
Okay.
explain why
Okay.
Trump won.
Okay.
I think we can explain why those Obama voters who were in areas of the country that were suffering from the highest levels of unemployment switched their votes. They were concerned about their futures and their families, hadn't gotten raises in 20 years.
But you and I don't think they're anti-Semites.
No,
Or
absolutely
racists,
not.
Or
But-
xenophobes.
No, I'm not suggesting that. But that does not lessen the impact of what we were saying before. Look, when Steve Bannon was asked at the Republican convention, what is Breitbart? His answer was, it is the home of the alt-right. So the question is, that was his answer. He was proud of it. He answered with,
I understand.
He answered with pride. If the alt-right isn't a problem, then there's no reason to have a problem with Steve Bannon. I want to suggest to you the alt-right is a problem. Not something we're hearing from just from the left, by the way, but just as much from the right in the Jewish world, both of whom look at this, see some anti-Semitism, and a great deal of hatred and prejudice directed towards others. Okay. There is no example in modern history where a leader goes after outsiders and immigrants and those on the fringes of society and doesn't ultimately go after the Jews. So raising these concerns does not say that everybody who voted for Trump is an evil person.
Again, are you saying that Steve Bannon goes after outsiders?
I am saying that. That's what the alt-right does. He provides a platform for those who, generally speaking, have focused on attacking those who are not white.
Okay, and the three of you agree.
Look,
By the way, either you agree
I
or
don't-
you don't agree.
No,
I mean,
I
Eric
don't-
is making a very strong case
Yes,
here.
and I
If
think-
you don't agree, you should tell him you don't agree.
I think the issue is being much too personalized in terms of Mr. Bannon, whom I do not assign great significance to. The larger issue is something else, and that is that this campaign, and again, don't demonize the president or the president-elect himself. I'm not saying he's responsible for everything that took place inside the campaign. The campaign itself fed upon a long tradition of American politics called populism, which had never entered into the actual presidential campaigns. It was always a side issue. It was there. It was never really elevated as significantly as it is as it was.
Williams
during
Jennings Bryan?
I'm sorry?
Williams, Jennings,
Well, that's
Bryant?
100 years ago. Okay,
Well,
that's way
nonetheless.
back. My point was simply the taboo was lifted. Perhaps of greater concern to me is that the taboo was also lifted in a number of European elections. In other words, we're witnessing that there is a current out there, broadly defined as populism, that Jews have never done terribly well by. I think it would be silly to ignore it.
What frightens you? What's the danger? What, oh my goodness, Donald Trump is president and it's bad for us. How is it bad for us?
Well, I'll continue to use the word normalizing. If it normalizes the idea that Jews somehow control the press or the government or the banks,
And this is what you've heard.
we started to hear this in conversation. We started to hear this much more openly spoken. And instead of it being dormant, we started to see this. Now, yes, and I agree, I thought the star was silly, and I'm not sure that the positioning of Soros and Yellen was a message to anything. And yes, I think it's possible to raise your hand without it sounding like it's this. I agree with all that. And I think you're also right when you say, you know, it doesn't look good for Jews if we look that hysterical when it comes to this. If it's not there, let's not make it into something that it's not. But I do think that when we look at what I would say is old school prejudice, when we start ascribing Jewish power as rigging the system, and that when this is not being in any way rejected and repudiated,
Okay.
right, by a major.
Well, I'll say this.
Right.
I watch, I read, I hear. I have not heard anybody say the Jews rigged this election. I've not heard it
Now
anywhere.
we're suspecting
Anywhere.
the FBI and the CIA to have
I'm
not
I don't know
reported what they were
so
saying.
when you say,
Well, Trump supporters don't think that this election was rigged because they won.
yes, but no,
there
no,
are people.
you're telling me that there are people who are saying the Jews did this. I don't, and if that's true, my point is that if you're right, this is serious stuff.
Well,
But I want to know that you're right.
yeah, but yes and no, because I think I told you I gave you an anecdote. I had been recently at some. It was actually one of your meetings, so I won't mention who it was. Who said this was the World Jewish Congress? Said something like, because I had said the same thing. I raised this question, and this person's response is, "This is ridiculous. We're worried about five guys in Idaho." Right, which was the argument that this is really just five guys in Idaho that we're talking
yeah,
about.
but that's sort of me.
Right, I know
That
that.
is
I know.
sort
In
of
fact,
me.
you
Right.
even said that to me
Right,
when you
right.
said you said.
I used the word
it sounds
seven.
like
Right,
seven
somewhere,
guys in
right,
Idaho.
right.
And then this person said,
In terms of America as a whole,
right,
it may
yeah,
be five,
right,
not seven.
Right. So, and then he said, which is something I certainly don't disagree with, because welcome to my world. What we should really be worried about is the progressive left and what you see on university campuses, because that's much more widespread. It's much more toxic and poisoning because it poisons the minds of students throughout universities all over the United States and makes life untenable for Jewish faculty and Jewish students who are just trying to, get into law school, right? And that's true in terms of there are certainly more than the five guys in Idaho, I think. And I do agree that what we see in the anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism on the progressive left, no one needs to convince me because, frankly, I'm a casualty of that. I live in that world. And I've been speaking out against it, and I speak at universities about this, and I joined a national network of faculty members that are there to try to respond to it, and I don't know, I'm not sure we'll ever really succeed. But I also, in saying that, don't think that we should dismiss something that what Steve says is correct. We simply didn't hear this. Now, you're saying, well, we don't really hear it.
And Betty's sort of saying the same thing.
Right. I think that Steve and Eric and I agree that
Okay.
it was more louder expressed and more widespread, not certainly a majority, but it was part of a theme. It was part of the theme of this election.
Yeah, I didn't hear it as a theme at all. Anti-Semitism? No, I didn't hear that as a theme ever. And the extent to which you may be right, and all three of you may be right, and I may be wrong. I think it would be a terrible development for the Jewish community of America. It would be terrible. I just don't think it's true. But if I'm being naive, and by the way, if there are members, if you're watching right now, L'chaim and JBS, and you've experienced what Eric and Steve and Thane are talking about, and also what Betty's talking about in terms of social media, let us know. We meet all the time. I'll be happy to then bring this back. Your input can help this discussion. But for me, I'm only telling you for me, and I never was once did I feel that feeling you get
Did you
when anti-Semitism is a reality.
Did you feel that there was anti-immigrant, anti-Hispanic, and anti-Muslim prejudice expressed during the course of this campaign?
They put you on the spot now.
But I think you.
I know I'm in the small minority, especially in the Jewish world. I heard it very differently. I heard everything,
including what you read to us.
Conditional. And by the way, I ask people all the time now, are you for open borders? I think that open borders is a legitimate position for someone to take. It is rational. It may not be good or bad, but I can see somebody arguing for open borders. And if they're open borders, it means anybody can come in. Doesn't mean you don't check them. Doesn't mean you don't vet. But anybody can come in, basically. I can't find somebody who says to me, I'm for open borders.
I never think we've ever had a policy
Well,
of open
yes, but
borders.
the
Every time
minute-
we've
okay, but
needed
the
Lautenberg Amendment
okay.
over and over to get in
I
Soviet
understand.
Jews.
My only point is
When have
that
we had open
this
borders?
is all Trump is saying. And that's why he resonated.
So you didn't hear any of those prejudices?
It's the line that the press took Trump literally but not seriously. America took Trump seriously and not literally. It was Peter Finch, was it? Who was it who screamed out the window?
Peter Finch.
Peter Finch, in what was the movie?
Network.
Network.
Sick
I'm
and tired.
sick and I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take
Mad
it
as
anymore.
hell, right, mad
Okay,
as hell.
but it wasn't evil. It wasn't mean. It wasn't like we don't want immigrants to America. We want them to come in legally, just legally.
Compare the statements of George Bush and the statements of Donald Trump on Muslims, on the whole range of issues. George Bush was a hero and a leader. And he spoke about difficult, sensitive issues in difficult times in such a way that he wasn't generating hatred. I'm suggesting that Trump did not rise to the occasion and sent a different message. And if there was not a word of anti-Semitism, that would concern me.
I understand. And just take it one step further. Now I assume everything you're saying is correct and that you've identified a flaw, a serious flaw, in a man who's now been elected president. I want to know what you feel the practical therefore is for America as a whole and for American Jewry.
I worry about one thing specifically, and here I'm a little more focused on Steve Bannon, somebody who's sitting down the hall from the president, maybe the last person he sees every night is an important person. I don't think Trump's domestic policies are going to work. There's no indication to me. He doesn't seem to have an action plan that makes sense to respond to those populist concerns that Steve spoke about so eloquently. What happens 12 months from now, 18 months from now, when we have a failed domestic policy, which I think is a strong possibility, not a given?
Yep.
At that point, is Steve Bannon going to be the one who is going to be fashioning a response and doing it in a way that he did it, in my view, during some of the previous campaign? That is intertwining hatred for outsiders and immigrants and so on with practical politics. Will he be diverting the attention of the American people from real economic issues and generating a difficult, contentious, and ugly...
And if he does.
And if he does, I think the Jews are in trouble. I think America's in trouble, and I think we need to organize.
I want to know what it means that we're in trouble.
It means that those who thought he was a demagogue and not presidential were right. That's what it would mean.
Okay, and what will happen to the Jews in the 2.5 years he'll have left? Are Jews going to experience institutionalized anti-Semitism? Are they going to experience informal anti-Semitism? What are you talking about?
I'll tell you what I said 6 months ago on this program, I'm sure it was, where I said, all I know is this, throughout history, Jews have never done well with mobs.
What's going to happen?
Well, throughout history, Jews have never done well with instability. I'd like to go back to what Steve said in the very beginning, which I totally agree with, which is that we're going to have to find a way to work with this president right away. We are dealing with a whole set of unknowns, with a whole set of appointees who've never served as elected officials, who've never sat on as heads of committees in Congress. And we're going to have to start from Aleph Beis with the meetings and educating and talking and so on and so forth and pleading our case. What do we do in America, whether it's for our own domestic interests or for Israel? It is called shtadlanut. It is called advocacy. And it hasn't changed since Theodore Herzl went to the head of the Ottoman Empire or Bibi Netanyahu met with Mr. Obama. This is what we do. We will have to keep doing it because we always have to work hard and earn to ensure our survival.
American Jewry remains, notwithstanding this election, it remains at an all-time high in terms of its position inside American society. American Jewish history is the story of Jewish acceptance. The diaspora basically America gave us every opportunity to express ourselves, to assert ourselves. This is the most assertive Jewish community in history. It's the most powerful, influential Jewish community in history.
I just want to repeat what Thane said before because I think it's so important and he's absolutely right. We must never normalize or permit to be normalized, the hatred and bigotry and the anger that is out there.
Absolutely.
That's the key. If that's our standard, I mean, it's been true for the Jews, it's true for others as well, then we're doing our job.
I think we all agree. What's your attitude about David Friedman being nominated now to be the next U.S. ambassador to Israel? And people are saying he's on the far right, and he called J Street capos, and he's saying that it's not that he's against the two-state solution, he just is against it in the current context where he doesn't see anybody on the other side to make peace with, and in that context he is much less anti-settlements than administrations have been in the past. And I wonder how American Jewry reacts to that. And of all the things it seems to me the Trump victory does, is it may, I don't know if Friedman will be confirmed, but if there is an ambassador to Israel who is as staunchly pro-Israel, and for years we've been complaining that the administration is not sensitive enough to the Jewish perspective and is sort of trying to be accommodating to the Muslim world and to the Arab world. And there are people who now feel that one of the things tragically is that as good a motivation as Obama had in reaching out to the Muslim world, it backfired. It didn't go anywhere. And ultimately, the Arab world did not respond well to him at all. And it's interesting now to see how they're going to respond to Donald Trump. But this appointment changes everything if it's confirmed. And when you talk about how the Trump victory may be the single most important event, it seems to me that the way that is manifest is that there will be an ambassador who says, I'm moving the embassy to Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. Why haven't we done it years ago?
It's law.
Yeah,
it's the law in the books.
Why aren't we doing it? Well, that's an enormous change for American Jewry. Now, how do you react to that?
Well, my first comment is, might be a little on the cynical side, but I do take some gratification from it, is that there's been absolutely not a word said about having an ambassador in Israel, in Tel Aviv, who's Jewish. In other words, that taboo has been lifted. If you remember, go back to the days of Henry Kissinger, the idea was let's keep the Jews out of that particular area. Now the taboo has been lifted. That's
nice.
I think that's great. Yes. Absolutely. So I said that's the positive side. That's the good news here. Look, the challenge is something else. The job description of ambassador is that it must defend the policies of the administration that it is representing. And therefore the challenge, certainly in terms of the confirmation hearings, is American policy has been very clear, going back now for a good number of years and through several administrations, that we are in favor of a two-state solution. We do not see settlements as being particularly helpful in terms of that. Some administrations have been more outspoken, some less, but every administration has said in one form or another that continued construction of settlements on the West Bank will not advance a two-state solution. it very well may hinder a two-state solution. As far as comments about capos, frankly, it is so disreputable, it is so irksome that a committed Jew would refer to those who disagree with him. And again, I have my own disagreements with many of the people that he's disagreeing with. But for him to refer to them as capos, I found that very personally insulting. And I don't say that as a Holocaust survivor, which I'm clearly am not, nor my parents. But I think the use of that terminology is particularly gross, particularly upsetting. As far as I understand, the job description of the ambassador is that he is closely tied to the administration.
Of course.
And therefore,
Yes, and people believe this now reflects Kushner
yes, if he represents,
and Trump's position.
if he represents what U.S. policy is going to be,
Then?
I would be deeply disturbed.
Interesting. How do you feel about Friedman?
It upsets me on several levels. First of all, I mean, this notion that what he is proposing is good for Israel, I don't believe it's good for Israel. I think you were perhaps misstating the case a bit. It's not that just, well, he's less anti-settlement. I mean, I read what I could find of what he had said. He is aggressively pro-settlement.
Yes, I didn't mean to say
and he
that.
is emphatically opposed to a two-state solution.
He is not emphatically. And he spoke to the president's conference and made it clear. What he's against is a two-state solution at this point in time.
If you put that together with his settlement activity, perhaps, I find that a little bit difficult to believe.
Okay.
And then finally, I mean, look, I agree with Steve. He said, J Street, they're worse than capos. They're worse than
I didn't know about the
capos.
worst part. I mean,
That was the phrase that he used. He was challenged on it, and he refused to back down. So we have a situation. I mean, I'm also somebody who has disagreed publicly with J Street on a number of occasions. But, I find myself all of a sudden categorized as a Nazi collaborator by somebody who is Jewish and is apparently going to be the ambassador to Israel. I think we have a situation where there are going to be elements of the Jewish community who are not going to want to receive such a person in their synagogue or in their organization. I think that's terrible.
Okay, what do you
Can I
say?
just add a word before, just to pick up on that? In terms of his pro-settlement activity, just bear in mind, regardless of how you feel about settlements, and the two of you can weigh in, recognize that every settlement that gets planted puts a two-state solution one step further away. Now, accepting your comment that he says, I'm not against a two-state solution, I'm against it right now, why should Israel be doing anything that places it one further step away? In other words, this is...
Okay. By the way, you've talked to Jews who answer that for you all the time. You may not agree with them, but you know what the argument is.
that if a two-state solution is not in the cards, why not build as many settlements as
Exactly,
you want?
right. And not only that, more than that, the Palestinian perspective is different from the Jewish perspective. You and I see a difference between the land inside the Green Line and outside the Green Line. The Palestinian is not. The Palestinian sees the land inside the Green Line exactly the same as the land outside the Green Line. And that's the problem. And the problem is that at the moment, you have another side which believes the only answer, as you keep saying on JBS, is river to the sea. And if that is what we're going to deal with for years and years and years, and last time you were on, you say it might not even be in your lifetime,
Quite
not
true.
maybe not in your children's lifetime. The position taken by those representing what David Friedman is, Steve, why are you telling me I shouldn't be?
Because let the Palestinians reject the two-state solution. Let the onus be on them, rather than Israel taking action that makes it one step more difficult.
But the Palestinians
you do
are
understand. You
rejecting
do
a
understand
two-state
what the
Oh,
argument is.
absolutely.
Okay, how do you feel about Friedman?
Well, an earlier incarnation of Thane Rosenbaum would be opposed to Friedman. This incarnation of Thane Rosenbaum doesn't think it's a bad idea at all, and it's not because of a change in Thane Rosenbaum. It's because of the Obama administration. It's a reset. It's a message appointment. It says, unlike the Obama administration, which saw the settlements as the primary obstacle to peace, this appointment is saying that's just nonsense. And anyone who went to college who has a soul knows that's not the primary. Yes, every additional settlement is an impediment to peace, but that's not the main thing. The main thing, as you know, that I've said hundreds of times on this show, is river to the sea. The Palestinians have demonstrated no interest at all in nation building, zero interest. In the United States, we like to refer to remember the Alamo. Well, in Israel, they say remember the Gaza. right? They remember that when we withdrew, we got rockets and we got terror tunnels, and we had no interest at all, zero interest in building a homeland and showing that you were possibly statesmen and neighbors. And instead, you've developed there's stabbings in the streets and singing from the river to the sea. If you keep singing to the river to the sea and holding the key around your neck to your grandfather's house in the West Bank, you're saying
inside Israel.
Inside Israel. Inside Israel, right. Inside Israel, of course. What you're really saying is we don't want Jews here anywhere. Not the West Bank. We don't want them in Tel Aviv. We don't want them in Haifa. We want all of it. And until you can demonstrate that you really are, and this is why when Steve says, let the Palestinians say that they're rejecting the two-state, they do it. They reject it every day, Steve. Every day they say, we don't want a two-state solution. And the way they say it is by singing to the river to the sea. And yes, I've always been opposed to the settlements. I say it all the time. You and I argue. I'm not a fan of the settlements. But what has happened in the 8 years of the Obama administration has kind of been a twisted thinking, sort of twisted anti-colonialist thinking, as to say, well, the Jews of Israel are sort of settlers. They're all of them, not just the settlers. They're all from Brooklyn. They're all not supposed to be there. They've taken away brown-skinned land that belongs to Palestinians. There are no Mizrahi Jews. There are no brown-skinned Jews. And that was sort of the ethos, and that really the United States needs to be on an apology for the way in which that's propped up dictators like Israel. This kind of thinking has been, I think, so toxic and so damaging and so misinformed, tragically misinformed, that a guy like Friedman actually comes up at the right time to say, no. It's not the settlements. Yes, Steve, it would be better if there weren't settlements, and I am opposed to settlements, but for this ongoing obsession with the settlements has been a mistake, and it's simply demonstrably false. It's not the settlements. It's the Palestinians being unwilling to live with Israel in that region.
I appreciate, by the way, the moral clarity you bring to it. In other words, you're saying, let's acknowledge once and for all the problem is Palestinian rejectionism and not the West Bank settlements, absolutely 100%. What does concern me is that it's an issue of Israel's moral high ground, on the one hand, some of which is forfeited by settlements. Number two, the atmosphere within Israeli society and American Jewish supporters oftentimes becomes one of, we can do it, let's keep on doing it, let's forget about a two-state solution. And in that respect, my concern is that the more settlements we have, the more we say we can live with a one-state solution. A one-state solution to me is a disaster for Israel, a disaster for the Jewish people.
But I just really don't see where there have been a building of settlements in years already. I really don't see where there have been new settlements for years, and I don't understand this challenge of Israel's morality because there is continuing proliferation of settlements. They have not been.
There has been.
There have not.
I'll give you the statistics and I'll give you the data.
I'm just telling you that, places they kept calling Ariel a settlement and Ofra a settlement and all kinds, and places that have been communities for the longest time, settlements. And this has really given the false impression. I am glad for this new ambassador, I think, because for a simple reason, and that is we might have now somebody from the administration who is supportive of Israel out of conviction and not only out of convenience. We really don't know how a lot of the other members of this new administration, including the president-elect, feel about Israel. And there's a big difference if you support Israel out of conviction than out of convenience. Conviction, it was Jack Kemp, was Scoop Jackson, were people like this. We don't know if this new president-elect is under that category or not. What we do know is that there is very often support for Israel because it's convenient, because you see it as an asset or a strategic asset. What we're looking for, and what I'm looking for in an ambassador is someone who cares about Israel deeply and who understands that that Israel has to defend itself, that Israel cannot have borders that are too porous, that cannot go back to 67 borders, and that will stand up for this. And I think this will make a big difference.
Yeah. I also want to say that the notion that this is not yet administration policy, I think, is misreading what happened here. I believe that this is the direct influence of Kushner, and that Kushner chose Friedman, and that in Israel, when it comes to Israel, Trump's going to rely on Kushner. And we also know, history has shown time and time again, you have a better chance for peace when the Palestinians really believe that America is taking a hard line against them. And that's what happened also with America and China. It was somebody on the right. It was Begin on the right with Egypt. It may very well be, and I'm not saying it will happen, but it very well may be that a Kushner-type Friedman alignment and Trump following it, where the administration is not basically saying the onus is on Israel, and that's what Obama said all
And
the
the
time.
blame, not just the onus, the blame.
Responsibility, and it could very well be that the Palestinians will maybe say to themselves, for us, now the more pragmatic, practical thing to do is work out some kind of peace negotiation, peace settlement with Israel. Maybe. But I don't think that that Friedman is outside of what Trump and Kushner want.
Look, James Mattis, the famous Mad Dog Mattis, he's going to be Secretary of Defense, the best appointment in my view in the Trump cabinet.
Interesting.
A serious, experienced, responsible adult, takes a tough, hard, realistic view of the world, both with regard to Russians and Iranians and so on. The last time he talked about settlements in public, he said it was a terrible problem and that it was moving Israel towards apartheid. And that was much reported on at the time. And of course, people moved on. So Mattis is going to be a very important force in this cabinet. Will Trump defer to Jared Kushner? We'll see.
You don't think so? You don't think so?
I don't think so. One word to Betty. Let's at least agree on the facts. This notion that there's no settlement.
I didn't say no settlements, but in recent years there have been very
Elliot
little
Abrams, who wrote an article I referred to before in this program in 2014, just wrote a follow-up, 2016, appeared in Foreign Policy, wrote it together with Uri Sadot, who's an Israeli researcher and demographer, and he looked at settlement numbers beyond the fence, in other words, outside of the established blocks. I don't have any problem with settlement in the current blocks. But since Netanyahu became prime minister in 2009. And what he says, first of all, it's hard to figure the numbers. And he said there are, in fact, two sets of numbers. In one set of numbers, the settlers outside of the blocks have grown from 70,000 to 90,000. And another set of statistics, also seemingly reliable, they've grown from 70,000 to 105,000. So between 20 and 35,000 settlers have been added in Netanyahu's most recent terms outside of the settlement blocks, all of whom would have to be removed if there were to be a two-state solution. That's a very significant number. Look what's going on over Amunah, removing 30 settler families. Here we're talking about moving roughly 100,000 people. And look, my final point, I've listened to all that you had to say. I'm a Zionist. I believe in a Jewish and democratic Israel. The details can be worked out by the Israelis. I don't want to dictate to them. But ultimately, if we don't have an Israel that is both Jewish and democratic, it's not true to Zionism, I want to suggest to you.
Is there anybody here you think thinks differently than that?
I am not hearing from voices that suggest the possibility of permanent occupation, how Israel is going to be both Jewish and democratic. There are ways to do that.
I think he means you.
When you're on campus, you're on campus. I respect that. You have to deal with students, all kinds of things. I've spent some time on campus, nowhere near as much time as you. So when the students say to you, okay, let's talk about Palestinian rejectionism, and let's say they agree, I certainly agree. I agree with that. But what do we do? Is your solution permanent occupation?
But you said you're a Zionist.
I am a Zionist.
One cannot be a Zionist if the path that we're on leads to this ongoing violence. If Israel is supposed to have a neighbor that they can actually count on as a true neighbor, the idea that we have now is there are no options because there's no one to negotiate with.
No, there is an option.
There is no there's the unilateral withdrawal, which we saw in Gaza, but the idea that there's still, I'm worried that there won't be Zionism at all, and there won't be Zionism at all is because Israel will be living with Gaza and the West Bank with rockets coming from both directions.
Steve referred to the option. The option is a policy, the intent of which is to create maximum separation between the Jewish population and the Palestinian population so that you leave open the option of a two-state solution. And there are a lot of responsible people, Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal, who believe, in fact, that that's what Israel should be doing. A policy of settlement as outlined by Mr. Friedman is not consistent with that. It's not maintaining separation. It's breaking down separation, and it's mixing two hostile populations. And it's hard for me to understand how that's a positive thing.
How do you respond to that?
I'm wondering if, I'm not quite sure that I understand what maximum separation exactly means. I'm not sure that the two populations have to be hostile forever and ever and ever. And as a Zionist, I do believe in the fact that I do believe in the possibility of Israel and the ability of Israel to settle in Jewish land if she so chooses. There are ways to have peace. And the ways to have peace is without the rejectionism, and without the attacks, and without the rockets, and the cessation of the hostilities. The hostilities are coming from the Palestinian side. That is what has to stop. Once that stops, I think you could be able to figure out all kinds of peaceful coexistence configurations.
Mm-hmm. By the way, do any of you feel it is inappropriate for the settlers to have to leave? There's some notion that the Palestinian position is that the West Bank should be free of Jews. And I've heard that in various ways numerous times. I don't understand how any American or any liberal Jew isn't outraged by the notion that a peace settlement involves removing every Jew from the West Bank. And we've all been on the West Bank. There's a lot of land there, a lot of land. I don't understand if tomorrow a peace agreement was made between Israel and the Palestinians, and they have their population centers, which are at the moment legitimate, they're existing, in some instances they're thriving. I hear Nablus is doing fabulous. You want to go to the mall in Nablus. Okay, so why couldn't the Palestinian state tomorrow have every settler who's there, as long as the settlers are willing to live under a Palestinian sovereignty?
Well, what does that tell you, Eric? What does that tell you, Eric? What do you see in that?
I agree with
How
that.
do you become a Zionist in that setting?
I agree with that. My problem is I've spent a lot of time in the Knesset, meeting with Knesset members across the spectrum, particularly on the right. And when you ask them directly, all right, this is what's going to happen. But at that point, the Jews have to be full citizens of the Palestinian state. They have to accept Palestinian sovereignty. Are you prepared?
They don't have to be citizens. They have to accept the sovereignty.
They can be citizens or not.
Yes, right.
They can be
But
citizens or not. But they have to accept sovereignty.
Absolutely.
They're under Palestinian control.
Absolutely.
They're not remaining in some extraterritorial sense.
Correct.
So there are a few people on the right, by the way, very few, who say, fine, if that's the way it'll be, and then they're perfectly okay with that. The great majority of those in the settler movement don't say that at all.
I don't think you're right. By the way,
Okay.
I think you're
I
correct.
believe
that
so.
You
I believe
started by
I am.
saying it was the Knesset.
Yes,
I
Knesset,
don't
it's
disagree
true.
with you in the Knesset, but I've talked to people who live on. We've done interviews for JBS with settlers who are in settlements on the West Bank And we asked that very question. If there was peace, but you'd have to live under Palestinian sovereignty, would you leave Carne Shalom Rome, or would you want to stay here?
Let's look at the polls on that and let's see who's right.
And you know, when it becomes a reality,
I have no issue with
it's
that.
a reality. I don't either.
No
I
issue
don't
with
either.
that.
And I'm annoyed that the American administration has not made that point.
But that's not Bennett's plan. Bennett, I mean, in
The
other words,
Israeli
who are the
people are
leaders?
overwhelmingly willing to have a two-state solution with all kinds of compromises, as you said, if there's real peace. We don't have that as a remote possibility at the moment.
The leader of the settler policy has a plan for the future. He lays it out very, very clearly. Those people in
You're referring
areas...
to Bennett.
Bennett,
Right.
not only Bennett. Those people in Area C will be given full citizenship in Israel, and those in A and B will be in a permanent state of, they will be in autonomy, which is another word for occupation. They will not have full rights in Israel. Neither will they be part of a Palestinian state because there won't be a Palestinian state. So the leader of the settlement party in Israel is advocating this views, and the policies that he's impacting are geared towards that end.
I'm going to say it again. If there is ever the kind of situation that Betty describes and that you hope for, I don't doubt for one moment that the Israeli people will do anything they need to do with any government that's in the Knesset. If the Knesset doesn't ratify it, they will change the Knesset.
This is not what the settler movement is saying. If they were saying it, I would accept it in a second.
But
But they're a
75%
small
of the
group.
Israeli people are resoundingly,
But not
Closer
the
to
settlers.
two-thirds
Okay.
in terms of that.
but
look,
resoundingly in favor of what Mark's
first of all,
talking about.
in terms of the actual facts on the ground, if you will, in this scenario that, yes, I do hope for, but increasingly I'm thinking that is utopian. In that scenario, there'd be a very serious question about who's responsible for security and safety of these people. And that's going to be, I think, next to impossible to resolve. Secondly, we've had experience, unfortunately, but we've had the experience of states in Europe that essentially where we said, oh, it'd be nice if all these people lived together. They really can't stand one another. And with the best of intentions on the part of key governmental figures, it still explodes into civil war. So that when you don't hear enough of it coming from the American administration, sure, in principle, yes, you're right. The idea, I think I said, as far back, I think, as 1979, I gave a speech at Yeshiva University, and I said, a very dovish speech by comparison to some of the people I was talking with. But I said, God forbid that the West Bank should become Yud and Rhine. I said that point blank. I still say that. But by the same token, I think you're not seeing more of those statements because the concern is, were all these things to happen, who would really be responsible for preserving safety and security of people who are living there? I'm also concerned about something else, though, Mark, and that is that, and it goes back to Thane's comments about 75% of Israeli society would accept it, which again, I think is closer to two-thirds. You're both right in that sense. They would accept it. But there's a very powerful one-third whose numbers are growing, if nothing else, by virtue of birthright, who essentially feel this land is ours. It was given as a promise by God to Abraham some 3,500 years ago. We do not have the right, in principle, to surrender 1 inch of it. That group, sometimes expressed now via hilltop youth, who say we're going to settle there no matter what, it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to dislodge. And again, with the best of intentions on the part of people who sit in the Knesset or sit in governmental circles, I'm not at all convinced that that 1/3 that opposes a Palestinian state could be brought around. Many of them could be, and perhaps that's something that needs to be worked on.
You know, part of the problem that I have when I listen to this kind of debate is that I don't know what the facts are enough. And I hear you and Betty disagreeing about how many settlements and how many settlers have come during Netanyahu's now term of office. I've never heard it as low as 2/3. I've always heard it between 75 and 80%. I believe most Israelis right now are arguing there can't be a two-state solution.
That's quite true.
But they can't because of who the partner is. I still believe that it's closer to 80-85%. If there were if Palestinians were going to make Canada next to America, I believe 85% of the Israeli people. I do not believe it's a third of the Israeli people are biblical Jews
Oh no, not at all.
who are
But
saying we can't give up this land because God gave it to
no,
us.
but no. The numbers who say it's God's land and God gave it to us, that you're quite right,
right.
10, 15%.
Exactly.
Then you add on to that what might be called those who say a Palestinian state would be a security disaster
Yes,
for the
that's
state
correct.
of Israel.
That's correct.
Therefore,
I
we're
agree.
opposed to
If
it.
that's what you're saying, we agree.
That's-
But that group can be moved.
Absolutely, yeah.
If the scenario all of us here would love to see happen. If Betty's wish and your wish came true, I believe that 15% would move, and that you would always have the 10 to 15% of the Israeli people who believe this is God's land. You're never going to convince them, but they do not represent 100%. They don't represent 100% of the settler community. There's a lot of people on the West Bank who are living there not for ideological reasons, and they're practical. And they're nice people, and they're good. And I'm not saying that those who are ideological are not nice people, but from my perspective, they are ideologically problematic for me.
Look, the problem is, Amona began as an issue in 2004. Here we're dealing with 30 families who moved onto land that was owned by Palestinians. It is now 2016.
Okay.
So 12 years have been spent dealing with 30 families who, according to Israel's Supreme Court, live on stolen Palestinian land.
Correct.
So there may be a rosier reality out there, maybe general sentiment is different and so on, but the problem is the media have been dominated by this story literally for over a decade.
You're right. At the same time, it was, as we're taping this week, that a compromise was worked with the people who live in Amona.
How much did that cost? You know how much it costs?
That's a different issue.
No, it's not a different issue.
Different issue.
In other words, so it means the
it
government of
always
Israel is
co-
going
it always costs.
to end up spending 12 years of fighting the court and over $30 million to compensate 30 families and to rebuild their homes and so on. So what I'm suggesting that unfortunately, it doesn't give me the confidence I would like to have, that we're leaving options open here and creating the possibility of what Betty suggests, we would ultimately all like to see.
Okay. As we have to end part one, I want to come back now to the focus here. We're discussing Friedman, and I argue it's Friedman and Kushner, who are bringing a different perspective out of the Trump administration. And that when we talk about Donald Trump being president, in this discussion, we've concentrated on two issues. One, is he going to change the tenor of America? And is it going to be a more contentious, is it going to be really what you're talking about is a darker America, where there will be more racism, discrimination, and what you have said is, if that happens, it'll be bad for the Jews, it'll be bad for the Jews, it'll be bad for the Jews. And then the question is, will it happen or not? And then the second issue was, Donald Trump has chosen somebody on the far right to be an ambassador for the United States to Israel. What's that going to mean for the Jewish relationship between Israel and America? Is it going to redound to the ill of American Jewry, and that's an area you deal with all the time? But that's, as we conclude this section, I want you all to speak to what is your concern or your worry? What's it mean for American Jewry in the state of Israel? Trump is going to be president. What's it mean?
I hope it will mean better for the state of Israel. If he's chosen an ambassador that wants to be ambassador to Israel out of conviction, if his support for Israel that he has stated that he has is going to be genuine and real, if it won't be undermined by choice of Secretary of State that comes out of the oil industry, I think it's very hard to tell right now, to be very honest with you. You have a lot of conflicting things here, different messages here.
So
we haven't even talked about Secretary of State coming out of
That's
Exxon.
correct. Right.
I mean, that's a big piece of this, isn't it, Mark? I mean, it's, we always get stuck. What we always get stuck in this group is, negotiating the peace process around this table.
Yes.
And I thought that this time we wouldn't be doing that, given the major event that's happened now that impacts the Jewish people. But we've spent 40 years of our lives working to try and separate Secretary of State from oil industry, haven't we? What is that going to mean? So is that consistent with appointing a David Friedman to be ambassador to Israel? I don't know. I'm not sure how this is going to work. Am I happy that there is an ambassador that out of conviction loves Israel? Yes. If I could just say one thing about moving the embassy to Jerusalem. In 1995, the Congress of the United States passed the Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995. It was bipartisan. Dole Moynihan was the legislation. I don't think we have to fear a lot about this, and I think we can expect something good coming from it. That's
Okay. All right, what do you think?
I think
Sum up your position.
I think Friedman was a bad choice. I do not believe that he will be an important figure in determining the policy of the United States on Israel. That's number one. Number two, I want to agree very much with Betty, and I did refer to this initially. The broader geopolitical picture is what I worry about most. Not that the peace process isn't important. I sort of
now he says.
It's very important, but probably we're not going anywhere here. And the broad geopolitical picture is very distressing. It worries me, on many fronts in terms of what's going on in Europe and what's going on in Asia, but certainly what's going on in the Middle East. I'm worried about the Secretary of State. I'm worried in particular about the connections to Russia that have become apparent, virtually every day now between this administration and the Russian government. I think we need to explore that, focus in on that in a way that we haven't up to now, and make sure that Israel does not become the victim of what could be a very dangerous and uncertain, international diplomatic scene.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what's your sense?
Well, one thing we've learned is that Donald Trump does not like to disappoint his base, and his base has always been decidedly isolationist. Even Donald Trump, throughout the campaign, said the kinds of things about, America doesn't have to be involved defending every war. We don't have to be involved. We have to get these other countries to fight their own battles, right? These were other code words for, America's involvement is too great. By the way, this is an area where Trump supporters and Bernie Sanders supporters could have gone bowling together because they actually believed in the same thing. And with respect to Israel, I fear that's exactly what they meant. Why does the United States give so much aid to Israel? Why are we involved in that part of the world? That part of the world is a mess, and why are we so emotionally invested in this? Remember, Donald Trump did not attract the evangelical vote. That was Ted Cruz's community. So it's not clear to me that other than Jewish Republicans, the core people that were within the Trump base were not people for whom Israel meant that much at all. Maybe there are those who thought, democracy in the Middle East matters and Israel serves as a bulwark within this otherwise sea of autocracies and theocracies. But my fear is that Friedman is, on one hand, it's not a misdirection, but it shows a misplaced emphasis that you think, this suggests that this is going to be a tilt toward Israel. Nothing is a tilt toward Israel if the United States is isolated.
Mm-hmm. Are you worried that the Trump administration will cut aid to Israel?
I'm worried that you're going to have a man who made his career out of deal making and tells you, I will cut the best deals. I know how to cut the best. Everything else was a terrible deal until I showed up. I know how to cut deals. And he might, because of the interest of his base, to say, one thing that the United States should be saving money on is its involvement in foreign wars and in foreign conflicts. Now, I can't disagree with everything that Steve said, because clearly the United States as a model of American Jewish integration and immersion into the broader is unprecedented. And of course, no analogy to the 1930s is anything but facile, because it doesn't play. But, it took a long time. Again, I don't want to do this because I'm going to get hate mail from your people. But
My people.
Yeah, your people. And I don't mean Jews. Who said, look, it took Hitler years, from 1933 to 1939. It takes a small erosion, which was, I think, the point that Eric was making.
Are we saying now that there's some Hitler here? No.
What we're saying is that what we now take for granted could be taken away. What we take for granted...
Because Donald Trump was elected president.
Not because his base, his constituency, has always had anti-Semitic feelings. Not all of them, but people share these views. The point that Steve was making is, and the point that I continue when I say the word normalizing, is it's good to not be able to express those views because it just taps into people's prejudices that we would want to have always suppressed.
Okay.
And we don't want an environment in which we open these things up, because once they're opened up, gradually they result in more disenfranchisement of
You and I agree on about 95% of things.
Except for this.
I don't see this at all. I don't see America going Nazi. I don't think that. I sort of agree with Betty that there's always been something. If there's a little teeny bit more, it's still 7 guys in Iowa, and Idaho. I don't worry. I don't have the worry that you
His own
have.
private
And I also,
Idaho.
my sense is, you're underestimating Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner's not going to let his father-in-law hurt Israel, and that's amazing. Even the most important thing the Jews have now is a son-in-law whom the president relies on more than he relies on Steve Bannon, who is passionate about Israel. If anything, he's also far right. So I don't see the worry that you have, and I'll still agree with you on 95% of things. Okay, and you say?
For what it's worth, I tend to think that for a variety of reasons, Trump, in terms of policy, in terms of action, is not likely, obviously I can be wrong, he's not likely to hurt either American Jewry or Israel in any significant way. In other words, in terms of actual policy, again, I may be overly sanguine here, but I don't see any direction that there's any desire on the part of Trump and his people, even broadly defined, that they want to hurt Israel or American Jewry. What should be of concern is the actual policies themselves, some of which we will agree with, some which we will disagree with, some which will be applauded, say, by the Orthodox community and be criticized by what I like to call the middles of Jewish life. There's the conservative reform backbone of the community. There's the unaffiliated who probably will look at Trump through a very different set of eyeglasses. So in terms of policy, I think it's going to be a very mixed bag. Some would say it'll be a wild ride because it'll have many mercurial ups and downs. But no, like Mark, I don't see any possible analogy that American Jewry stands on a precipice where things are going to start falling apart. That said, without question, I'm concerned and upset that during this campaign, the so-called taboo on expressing anti-Semitic rhetoric was lifted. That depresses me. It doesn't drive me to the precipice, though.
I am so appreciative to all 4 of you. Just wonderful. That's part 1 of our year-end L'chaim Roundtable. I hope you'll be with us next time when our panel, this wonderful panel, and I appreciate both the difference of opinion and the nuance, and it's very important. And I don't know where, you take part in debates all the time and discussions, but you understand on American television, you don't need to hear this kind of.
No, you get sound bites. This is not sound bites.
This is wonderful. Anyway, I hope you'll be with us when our panel will resume for part 2, a discussion of the events of Jewish importance in 2016, and we'll look ahead to 2017. Of course, I hope many of you will take the time to be in touch with me with any reactions you may have. Stay on my camera. Right? You'll be in touch with me with any reactions you have to anything you heard discussed on this edition of L'chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. Social media. I look forward to hearing from many of you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.